If you're in a complex emergent world like ours, you have a different story. You can't assume that the rules are given, that the resources are given, and the goals are given. You can't make that assumption. Because the rules will change, the goals will change, the resources will change. And so you can't calculate the way you would if you were playing chess. So the scenario that you make is different. So it's very important, again, to be able to distinguish the different ways of thinking about the future and to enlarge our canvas to see more ways of thinking about the future. So one of the ways that we did this was, and we hope to also push the futures literacy agenda and diffusion of futures literacy in Africa, is through the Imagining Africa's Future, a UNESCO Priority Africa project. So this is a project that will design and test innovative prototypes for developing futures literacy across Africa. It will generate research on design and implementation of collective intelligence knowledge creation processes in Africa. It will enlarge and establish research centers and networks, and it will achieve on-the-ground empowerment on specific challenges using the future, all of which builds futures literacy. So this is a project that's probably going to see the light of day in 2016, this project here. But it follows through on what I was talking about before, and all of the tests that we've been running, the experiments we've been running. So that's the end of my reinforcing the point that we're doing this futures literacy, and I'm very thankful for the issues raised on how to think about the future differently. Here's a way to begin to think about the future a little differently. It's to give up on to try and get beyond our existing frames of reference. So I'm going to give you some tools, and just so that you don't, after lunch and all the rest fall asleep completely, you're going to go back into groups in about 15, 20 minutes, okay? So let me just take you through this. Now, the reason to pay attention to this is that I'm giving you variables. Thais likes variables. I'm giving you variables, and the variables are ways of describing the future. And this model that I'm about to describe to you basically transforms industrial society into its opposite. Okay, so you'll see how it does that. So it's what I call the learning-intensive society. It's not prediction, it's not preference. So please be very clear about that. I am not making a prediction. And I am not saying that this is good. What I'm trying to do, and this is a really crucial part of developing people's futures literacy, is to get people to realize that their scenario, the image that they have of the future, is determined by the assumptions of their model, basically. Because once you have the assumptions of the model, you can then put the variables up or down, but it's the model and its assumptions that determine the image of the future that people have. So this is a scientific proposition. I think it's fairly safe. In this case, all I'm trying to get people to understand is that you can build your own models. In some senses, this is quite radical, because it provides you with the basis for imagining futures that are your own. So this is one of the key aspects of empowerment. When people come to a futures literacy knowledge lab, they actually begin to play. And when we brought 500 young people together in Paris, 2 months ago, they built sculptures to illustrate that they can build their own model. But just the beginning, giving people the feeling that they too can come up with a way of imagining the future that's not necessarily the way that was given to them in their economics class or their political science class or by the government. So this is an exercise. It's a way of giving people a chance to play with, this is my whole, sorry, it crashed. Just 1 second. PowerPoint crashed. So now we're going to do stage 2, Futures Literacy No Lab, tools for reframing. So the idea of the reframing here is to imagine a learning-intensive society. Not prediction, not preference. Change the assumptions we use to imagine the future. A world where formal and informal has been transcended, and the relationship to resources is endogenous to quality of life. So you hear what I'm saying? In the scenarios that we just heard earlier today, right, we heard a lot of discussion about these aspects. Were we going to have, some sort of autonomous informal? Were they going to, were the outlaw republics of the slums of tomorrow going to declare their own sovereignty? So can we overcome that way of thinking? In other words, one of the things that constrains us is precisely that we continue to think about cities and difference as based on the markers of today. So I mean, imagine a shift from feudal to capitalist society. In feudal society, the marks of status existed, like in capitalist society, marks of status and difference exist. But they're very significantly different, and the way that they're produced is very different. So one of the challenges for us is how do we produce the signals of status and difference in the context of another society? If we begin to play with that parameter, we begin to play with the basic parameters of how the society is organized. So I'm just pointing out here in this little scenario that many of you have seen before, just that we tend to reduce the world to agriculture and industry. And because industry is declining in some countries and going up in some other countries, we're either hopeful or pessimistic. We're either in the unknown. Who knows what's going to happen in Finland these days, because we're at the edge, the frontier of industrial society. And whoopee yay for Brazil, and then because they're going up the industrial curve. Well, they're not so happy at the moment anymore. But I mean, this is the kind of. But the problem with this is what I would call poverty of the imagination. The model itself is constrained. We have missing categories. So here are the variables. Kais talks about variables. Here are variables. What if one of the variables of value creation becomes social identity? What if one of the variables is craft and creative, as we were talking about this maker movement? If you begin to change the categories, you can think of a different system of accounting, which can allow you to think of a different system of wealth. What we're talking about when we talk about water and pricing is a signaling system for value. And that's just one manifestation of a signaling system of value. There are many ways of establishing and signaling value. And the issue becomes, if we move beyond fiat currency by nation states to some sort of peer-to-peer currency system, how does that relate to things like resources? In other words, if we change the underlying transaction systems, can we change the business models? In which case, what's that mean for the entrepreneurship of the informal economy? Because it's no longer informal. Or the formality has been shifted and opened up. So systemic economic transformation changes what and how we produce. I want you to just think about unique creation for a moment. Everybody here is conversant, and I'm being rather quick and technical, but the basic idea of competition, everybody here understands, which is that there's competition for this water bottle. That it's a product, which is a basic product. There can be many producers. You will choose on the basis of quality and price, right? But what happens if we move to unique production, unique products? The whole notion moves us beyond mass production, mass consumption. So, again, if I get technical for a moment here, and I think it's important for this group, there's a whole mathematical and philosophical area of study which talks about possibility spaces and the question of how we represent our imagination and how do we use our imagination in a rigorous way. So this is a possibility space, and it's a mechanism for assisting us in thinking about the future outside our existing framework. It's still criticism. It's still based on aspects of the existing reality. But the idea is to try and break out of the existing reality by critiquing certain key elements. So if you look at unique creation, and you think about learning intensity, you have the mass production, the empowered worker, the artist, the researcher, and the learner. Now, the artist that I'm talking about up here is not the Picasso, not the genius artist. It's the artist of banal creativity. It's the artist that everybody has when they learn and when they discover. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that we can go beyond the supply and demand issue. So for instance, one of the key points that was raised in our previous discussions this morning and in your scenarios was supply and demand. Because we have a conception of how we organize things, whether it's schooling or healthcare or Obviously, industrial products, we think in terms of supply and demand.